Welcome to CTRMRadio, an ad hoc podcast from Commodity Technology Advisory. And today I'm talking to a panel of experts on some regulatory issues that may be of interest to you. And I'd like to start by asking the panel to introduce themselves briefly, starting with Peter Willis, please.
So my name is Peter Willis. I'm a partner at Bird Bird, and I specialise in energy regulation and, in particular, advising on REMIT investigations and compliance.
Very good. Aviv Handler.
I'm Aviv Handler on ETRadvisory. We were a consulting company. We help people out on rules such as REMIT, MAR, MIFID II, and EMIR, things like that.
Thank you. Shane Henley.
Hi there, I'm Shane Henley. I'm the head of product at RegTrail. We specialise in providing regulatory and compliance intelligence to the energy sector.
And Lorne Chambers.
Hi, Lorne Chambers, Head of Monitoring Solutions at CubeLogic, and I've been building and deploying surveillance solutions for the last 25 years.
Super. To get started, I'll ask Peter if you just sort of briefly introduce the current sort of regulatory regime that we're about to discuss, Peter.
Yes, of course. Well, so REMIT has been in force for some years now, the regulation on wholesale energy market integrity and transparency. It got off to a slow start with enforcement, but we've seen a very steady flow of enforcement decisions from regulators around Europe. The particular focus now is on ACER, which will have the power to carry out its own investigations, and it is just gearing up, we understand, this autumn to be ready to carry out dawn raids, and it still remains to be seen how many it'll do and where it'll focus its attention. But I think that is making a number of businesses just think about compliance and what's the likelihood of these things happening.
I can imagine. And with that in mind, perhaps I could ask you if REMIT enforcement is consistent across Europe.
Yes, to some extent, in that all of the regulators are applying the same rules. They're all applying REMIT, in principle, all sort of subject to the supervision of the European Court of Justice and in accordance with the ACER guidelines. But there are very noticeable differences in transparency and level of activity, which suggest, perhaps unfairly, I think, different levels of sophistication. So we see authorities like the French Cordis and the Spanish CNMC publishing very detailed REMIT decisions of 30 or 40 pages, which set out procedural steps and refer to the ACER guidance and previous case law in some cases. You may not always agree with their conclusions, but at least you can see how they got there, and the decisions give useful pointers on what REMIT means and how you comply. But then in contrast, we see authorities like the Romanian ANRE, which only publishes very brief summaries of its decisions, which makes it very difficult to understand exactly what its focus is. And given the number of decisions that it takes and the level of penalties imposed, that's quite a concern. And then similarly, we see authorities like the Danish authority, which has taken some very important decisions on things like capacity hoarding, which again is very lacking in transparency and is very difficult to see exactly what it's objecting to in some of these situations.
Thank you. Aviv, have there been issues with regulators forming views in investigations that are different to market practice, and what has previously understood as being permitted?
To a degree, and that follows on from what Peter was just saying. And a good example of this is capacity hoarding, and what is understood to be permitted and not permitted in terms of capacity hoarding. So the thing we have to remember is this: it's that REMIT covers physical types of market abuse as well as the traditional financial ones like spoofing and layering and wash trades and all of those sorts of things. So the concept of withholding and hoarding is a relatively new science. The first ever REMIT fine in Spain in 2015 was a bit of a surprise for many people. Well, what's withholding? That's what we thought at the time. That's now 11 years ago, so when we saw the fine. So we've had years to discuss it. And that's a case in point in that that was a relatively large fine, which is sort of still ongoing, that story. And it was for something which wasn't very well understood. And we've seen the same with things such as capacity hoarding, where it would appear that the decisions of regulators break new ground and perhaps go further than previous guidance. So in the case of capacity hoarding, there was a paper from ACER a few years ago now on capacity hoarding, and it laid out all sorts of guidance as to how to avoid the offence of capacity hoarding. And yet we see cases that go further than that. For example, in cases where we use all of the capacity that we claim, still being considered hoarding in further papers that have been issued by other regulators. So that's something that people struggle with a bit. I think that we need to really understand that this is an emerging science, and so to prove beyond reasonable doubt that somebody broke a rule where we're still discussing what it really means makes it hard to comply and makes life hard for compliance departments. And following on from what Peter said about transparency, the lack of transparency in some decisions, where those decisions aren't documented in public as they should, just makes it very difficult to comply and increases the risk of being fined for something where you thought you were you were in safe territory, so to speak.
Okay, so let's make it even more complicated. Lorne, the activity that ACER could do enforcement on has probably already happened. How far back could it go, and what can firms do to prepare?
Yeah, I think the limitations probably differ between different member states. But if you look at the guidance in REMIT 2, you need to keep records for 5 years, so there's an indication there. And then if you look at the cases, there's a typical length of 2.5 years between the actual market activity where they disclose that and the actual enforcement, and it can range right up to 5.5 years. So, if you're looking at 5 years back, that's going right back to 2021 and the energy crisis. So there's quite a lot of data there that could be actioned in the next year or two. In terms of what could firms actually do, I think, first of all, think about data reconstruction. So can you actually go back and rebuild your order and trade activity and your positions from 3 or 4 years ago? Many firms may have migrated systems, so that might make that a little bit difficult. And then that would be a problem before you even get to the substance of the actual behavior. Second, do you have any contemporaneous rationale documentation? So in a lot of the cases, the NRAs have cited the absence of written commercial rationale as an aggravating factor. So, it's a bit more compelling to have a memo that was written at the time than something that's a retrospective explanation. And third, I think if you can demonstrate the history of your compliance program, not just its current state. So when did you expand your surveillance coverage? What triggered that expansion? What had changed? And perhaps a regulator assessing mitigation isn't just asking, do you have a system? But perhaps they're asking more whether your organization has shown a genuine evolving response to compliance risk. And if you think about a well-run surveillance platform, that's creating an audit trail as a byproduct. And firms that can show a documented compliance improvement history are probably going to have a better time of it than someone who's trying to retrospectively construct something because they didn't have a system.
Yeah. And Shane, how are NRAs helping the market to learn from REMIT enforcement actions in practice?
Yeah, I think that question overlaps with what Peter mentioned earlier. I think the range of detail published, this is something that we obviously actively track and we try and analyze. And I think one of the frustrations from our user community is just the sort of wide and varied range of detail that you get from the different NRAs. I think if we were to be issuing gold stars and silver stars, I think there's probably 5 that within the EU at least that do a pretty good job. Peter's already mentioned Quartus and CRI in France and CNMC in Spain. I think ARERA as well in Italy are pretty good, although I'd probably downgrade them to a silver star because they often redact quite important information, or at least information that would be useful, to market participants. So, for example, recently on an inside information and insider trading case, they redacted a whole lot of information about the specific generation units, the capacity, the timings, etc. All of these things are quite important for market participants to learn from. I think also the FINs actually have done quite a good job as well. They publish quite detailed case decompositions or decisions. I think outside of the EU, I think the GB market, obviously with Ofgem, they do quite a good job when they do enforce under their instance of REMIT. And I think similarly the Norwegians, in VRME and in Norway, they also publish quite detailed accounts. But aside from them, I think, the remainder, per Peter's point, some have issued some pretty hefty fines. Some have taken some quite extreme action, including arresting individual traders, but have not publicly put out much information that the market can learn from. And I think this is certainly something that there's room for improvement on, and maybe also a missed opportunity when the level 1 text of REMIT was recast in 2024. Perhaps there should have been a provision in there, compelling regulators, notwithstanding their perhaps local rules or local legal concerns which may prevent them from doing so, but should compel them to publish as much information as is reasonably possible to help the market to learn.
For me, this all sounds a bit confusing and a little alarming, to be honest. Aviv, how are they looking for physical abuse, such as capacity hoarding or withholding, for example?
Well, there's two groups of people there. There's the regulators, and then there's market participants. So, yeah, I think regulators monitor for these things. They have a lot of sources of data. For example, they have access to all the physical platforms, physical data. They also get transaction reports and order reports via REMIT as well, via REMIT transaction reporting and all of those things associated with it. So regulators and TSOs have access to a lot of the data. I think the challenge is more for market participants who run surveillance systems, such as CubeLogic's one that Lorne represents. The challenge is monitoring for that. And looking at whether what you are doing and have done is or isn't permitted. So challenge number one we talked about, which is just defining what we think is allowed. So let's assume we've decided what that is internally. And as I said, that could be different to what a regulator thinks. How do you look for that? And again, this is a challenge. Because you need usually not only transactions and orders, but also physical data and things like that as well to look at things properly and see in each example whether you've claimed all the capacity on a particular border. Those data feeds aren't always that available, so it becomes very hard to monitor whether what you're doing is correct or not. In the past, surveillance systems themselves haven't had this built in as an alert. I believe, and I'll let Lorne talk about this, that Cube is now covering that to a degree, and that's great. I think that's the direction that the surveillance systems could go in. At the same time, there's always going to be a gap for the more physical types of abuse. So I think that no surveillance system can cover everything, and that if market participants want to properly monitor what they're doing, they're always going to have to supplement with their own tools. It's just the only way to do it, because there's always more that you can do, and also because of this divergence of opinion on what hoarding is. That's what people do. So they build tools around it. And rules as well, give traders clearer guidance. So it's not only about software, it's about coming to a view internally on what you feel is and isn't allowed based on what's published, based on your own view and based on looking at the rules, and then making sure that traders properly understand that and keep to it.
Peter, does that sound from a legal perspective like a safe bet? And is there anything you would add to that advice from Aviv?
Yeah, I mean that's the perfect starting point. But there is some uncertainty. You can advise on what you think is going to be compliant with the current interpretation of REMIT and the guidance and the case law and so on. But we do see authorities taking different views on some of these things and changing their views, and that's the dangerous area. You can comply with what you think the rules say, but and there's also the point that the regulators don't always understand how these markets work and don't always understand the underlying economics and why you're doing this. And so you can spend a lot of time explaining to the regulators, well, actually, this was justified. This trade did reflect the market fundamentals and our own economics and so on, and the physical characteristics of our plant, when you're talking about physical cases. And in some cases you can persuade the regulators that actually there wasn't an infringement, but it's time consuming and costly for the business. And more clarity and certainty up front from regulators on exactly what it is that they're looking for would be very, very helpful.
Before I move on, there's the threat of dawn raids as well. Can you get into what a dawn raid constitutes and how a market participant could prepare for such an event?
Yes, certainly. I mean, a dawn raid is really just a sort of rather dramatic term for the inspectors, either from ACER, possibly any time now, or more likely perhaps from national authorities, turning up at the premises of a business and asking to inspect documents. And usually, what they'll do is they'll turn up with some sort of authorization of either a court order or their own decision, and say, let us in. We suspect you of infringing REMIT, and these are the things that we want to look at. They are typically very high stress events for the businesses concerned. I've done a few dawn raids, and it's one of the most stressful things for an in-house team. But with a little bit of preparation and management, you can reduce that a little bit. So, I mean, I think statement of the obvious is try not to be raided, and make sure that your compliance program is up to date, and that it covers some of the things that Aviv has been talking about. Making sure that everything is justified. Ensure that the orders are placed on their merits and not to secure some other objective. Then also, I think what I'd call sort of damage limitation, that slightly ties in with the point about how long these investigations can take to kick off. Make sure that your messaging, your shift logs, and so on are fully reflective of what's been happening. And traders are quite likely to have left after 2 or 3 years, and will the people who are left be able to understand those messages and shift logs? Will they be able to understand the abbreviations that have been used? And also, are these documents sort of liable to misinterpretation a few years later when there isn't the same sort of context? So those are a few things you can do up front, but I think in particular, sort of having a decent dawn raid plan in place, making sure that everybody knows what to do. The critical points on a dawn raid is reception. Sometimes they're instructed not to let people in, and that can just lead to a sort of almost immediate fine. So they need to know that when there is a dawn raid, they need to let the inspectors in, show them to a room, and immediately alert the response team and external counsel and so on. Really, these days, dawn raids are all about IT, and so making sure that your IT is ready to be inspected is important. One of the first things the inspectors will want to do is make sure that there's no scope for deleting or modifying data, and so they will want to lock down inboxes and systems and so on, which can be very disruptive. We've had cases where inspectors have come in and said, we want these inboxes locked, and you've got people who then can't do their business for a day, which costs money. So making sure that you understand your system architecture, and for example, if you've got Office 365, how to apply litigation hold, which will lock down the system while allowing business to continue, is important. So involving your CIO and so on in your dawn raid plan is essential. Making sure that the systems are ready, making sure people know what to do. To what extent do I need to answer questions if they ask them? Can I ask for more time to think about it? What happens, for example, if they want you to shut down your trading system so that they can access the records of that? Is that even possible? And is there an alternative that you can do to allow them to extract the data and to make sure that the systems aren't modified while allowing you to continue trading? What happens if you've got positions to close and so on? So there are all of these kind of things to think about up front before a dawn raid happens, to try and minimize the pain. It's never going to go away, but you can minimize it and manage it a little bit so that it becomes a difficult process to go through, but not one that is massively disruptive to the business or to the sanity of the individuals concerned.
Thank you. Lorne, to what extent does a system help with all of this?
Yeah, I think a system, it's reactive in the sense that it's looking at trades after the fact. It's not telling you before you even do an order or trade that one's going to break the rules. So, a surveillance system is really there to help you identify behavior that's happened. And then you want to create this feedback loop from compliance back to the front office to say, well, this trading pattern that you've got here, this is something that's probably going to butt up against the limit or the spirit of the rules. And we might want to just tweak how we do that. And we certainly see across our customer base, they do have that feedback loop in place. They are able to adjust how algorithms are running, whether the algorithms are actually doing what they say they're doing in the documentation. And I think that feedback loop is really important because many surveillance analysts can say how many alerts they closed, but how many can say how much trading activity they've changed. And I think that's really the true test of a well-functioning compliance department. If I go back to what we're talking about with capacity hoarding earlier, like Aviv says, it's a relatively new topic. If you think about layering, which is a well-known topic today, I was part of a team that wrote some of the alerts around that back in 2006, 2007, 2008. But those algorithms haven't stayed still. They've changed a lot over the last sort of 15, 18 years. So we'll get this capacity hoarding algorithm out there with our clients. We'll start to find where it behaves well, where it doesn't behave so well, where you need different parameters for different cross-border points. And it's all going to be a learning experience. But ultimately, what a system is trying to do is to serve up enough unusual points of interest to a compliance officer that they can see where there could be problems brewing. And then they can take proactive steps to retrain the traders or to point out, what's a limit too far, and then hopefully prevent something bad happening in the future.
Yeah. And Shane, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think, as Aviv alluded to, I think capacity hoarding, and particularly capacity hoarding when it comes to the SIDC market, I think as we've discussed before, where capacity is allocated implicitly, it is just a bit of a data nightmare to get normalized data feeds at this, MTU granularity that you have to. And then, of course, taking, cross NEMO capacity into account as well. And of course, the likes of EPEX, Spot, and Norpool don't always provide this data in a consistent and uniform way, and also at a consistent, uniform time. So I think, all of these data challenges are ones which have to be overcome before you even get to the conceptual complexity of systematically, at least, monitoring for this type of behavior.
Another thing, Shane, is that fact finger trades can be interpreted as abusive under REMIT and have already garnered some penalties. So what should firms do to mitigate that particular risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think this is a burgeoning topic, and I think the thing that's gotten a lot of people's radars was a recent announcement of a proposed fine against Kynect. Was a Swedish trading firm that got penalized by the Finnish regulator EV, originally back in December 25, but then I think it was in April this year, there was a proposed fine of around 9.2 million euros. And I think if you read through that case and sort of look at some of the, besides the eye-wateringly large fine, if you look at some of the sort of claims that the Kynect firm made about, we took all sort of, I guess, expected steps, publishing a urgent market message quickly, meeting with the exchange to try and see what could be resolved, actually going into the market and trying to purchase back, I think in the end, around 98% of the volume that they had erroneously traded into the market at great expense to themselves. Coming out the other side of it with a major fine is I guess quite surprising. Now, it still has to be confirmed by a market court in Finland, so it's by no means final. It might well get watered down. But the fact that a regulator is willing to do this, and I would point out as well, actually, that there's some quite significant inconsistencies there as well. There was a large utility that I shan't name that was essentially let off the hook for very similar, in fact, multiple instances of that behavior back in 22. And then, of course, taking that cross-regulatory inconsistency lens as well, the Norwegian regulator for an equally large trade error also let the firm off with a no fine and a fairly light slap on the wrist. So there's a lot of inconsistency, which I think scares firms. But I think back to sort of Peter's point he made earlier, saying that dawn raids are all about IT now. I would argue that the days of a trader hitting an extra zero by accident are probably the lesser of the worries. It's now locked down to automated trading. And I think one of the things that has evolved significantly in recent years, of course, is the large amount of data ingestion and sort of this confluence of multiple feeds coming from multiple places that need to be considered when they're going into a tool which might be making trading decisions or even placing orders in the market. And I mean, indeed, that's what happened in the Kynect case, is there had just been some upgrade work to I think it was a forecasting tool. It ended up timesing the forecast production volumes by 1,000, and there you ended up with them trading, I think it was about half a day's worth of the entire Finnish market in an erroneous trade. So, obviously it goes to say that pre-trade controls are important. And, when I used to advise firms on this a decade ago, it was all about, 4 eyes and how do you get, traders to make sure that things bring into their trade capture systems are reviewed before major mistakes happen. But of course, now it's far more about, automated systems and possibly algos as well. And how do you make sure that there's controls over this? And I think a very good reference for this actually is it's a very good REMIT best practice document that the Nord Pool Exchange puts out. They dedicate quite a few paragraphs to this topic, and they talk about the need for firms to, given that there's implicitly time pressure involved in these things. So, if you make an error, making that decision quickly about what you put out to market and then what the next steps are, it's important to have things like pre-made templates to make sure everybody's trained around the use of them. Then also to have maybe checklists in place where you can sort of step through and say, okay, this is, we have completed this action, let's move to the next step now, go consult counsel, next step, and ultimately determining whether a suspicious transaction order report needs to be submitted. And given that now, depending on how you read Article 15 of REMIT, is a requirement. You do have to report these things when there are potential violations of Article 3 and 4. So I think firms need to look more at the sort of the system side and definitely consider, when there are changes to systems, when there are changes to feeds, to make sure that those are in place. And I think at a more basic level, whenever there are preventative controls offered by the venue or by the trading platform that you're using to access a venue, activate them. I just think there's very little argument for not having these in place. And indeed, in that Kynect case, that was one of the observations from Yenigi Verasto, is that they had, for whatever reason, not enabled these. And there's a final point. I think just there should be an awareness that obviously auction markets are quite different to continuous markets. So each of these will have subtly different ways of being approached if an error is made, particularly at what point that error is discovered. And I think that is quite a key question. Is when you do identify it, because, of course, the timing of a urgent market message when it is published is important. And how do you sort of mark that moment where it's been discovered that you've made a mistake? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's less obvious. I think these are basic things, but I certainly would implore people to go look at that Nord Pool best practice report, because I think that does give a fundamental basis. And of course, it was created by many market participants working together to input that. So not surprising, it's a good and practical document.
Very good, thanks. I guess go back to Lorne and just talk about market surveillance systems in terms of, obviously, they define activity after the fact, but they don't stop a trade from happening. So is there some feedback loop between compliance and front office that can be preventative?
Yeah, and I kind of touched on this a little bit before, where, when you put a surveillance system in place for the first time on trading activity that you previously didn't have a view of, it's going to flag up lots of interesting things, and it might be potential layering, potential spoofing, or various behavior like that. And compliance departments have to quickly get a handle on, is this borderline, or is this actually okay? Are we just market making? And if they find things that they don't think are within the spirit, then they need to go and have those conversations with the front office. They need to have discussions about potentially changing those parameters. And I think that's where you see that positive feedback loop, because the job of the compliance department is really to keep the organization safe. And they don't do that by just processing alerts. They do that by having that feedback loop back to the people doing the trading in the first place. So yeah, I think that's really important. And there is a distinction between your post-trade surveillance and your pre-trade controls. And the pre-trade controls have really got to be built into the technology stack, so built into the algo platform. And I think that's where you can get quite a bit of diversity, because some organizations will buy off-the-shelf algos where those kind of pre-trade controls have been built as part of a product roadmap. It's not something we do, so I'm not plugging anything here. And then you have the firms who build their own. And the question is, do they have the expertise to understand all those rules and to build all those pre-trade controls in? So yeah, I think it's quite important to separate what is a pre-trade real-time technology solution within your trading infrastructure versus what is a post-trade surveillance where you rely on the feedback loop of compliance analysts working back to the front office.
Okay, well, this is obviously a very deep topic, and one that people are learning as they go, I suspect. So in order to wrap this up, what I'd like to do is just ask each of you if you have any sort of final thoughts that are specific to the topic, and maybe we'll start with Peter.
Yes, I mean, as I said, not only making sure that your compliance program is fully up to speed and reflects, some of the issues that we've been talking about, but also that you are ready, that you have given some thought to, what happens if there is an investigation. What will my evidence say? What will the chats and the shift logs say? And how can I make sure that any sort of disruption from an investigation is minimized? Whether it is an actual dawn raid or just a written request for information, which actually in many ways can be more disruptive, because you've then got to do all of the digesting and processing of the data to send it off to the regulators. So how would I deal with that? Do I have the processes to be able to pull this data out and analyze it and present it? Can I put a litigation hold and all of that sort of stuff? So quite a lot of planning up front just to get ready for the hopefully never to happen event.
So preparation is key. Aviv, what about you in terms of summary?
I think two things. One is in terms of being ready for or making sure that you reduce the risk of an investigation, is make sure you run proper, honest market abuse risk assessments, MARAs. The bar is being raised by regulators, and so market participants should be doing the same. The level of surveillance that you had 5 years ago, even if you haven't changed your activity, may no longer be adequate. So one needs to do a good, honest MARA and keep that up to date and keep acting on it. So that's part one. And part two, which is related to that, is form a solid opinion of what you think is and isn't allowed. Now, that might diverge from what a regulator ends up saying, as we discussed earlier, because we get surprises. But if you as a market participant aren't solid on what you think isn't allowed and give traders solid advice, it's going to be very difficult to defend yourself. Now, if a regulator disagrees with you, that happens, but at least you're doing that as a firm, having thought about those issues.
So essentially, recognizing the importance of this area is also key in your opinion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Shane, let's hear your final summary.
Yeah, I mean, I think just circling back to what both Aviv and Peter, actually, and Lorne discussed earlier, I mean, I would certainly pay a lot of attention to what is coming from this REMIT Investigations Department. I mean, it's quite clear that ACER will be permitted to investigate across Articles 3, 4, and 5 from the rules, but I guess it's all encapsulated by the proviso that it must involve more than one member state. And if you start to sort of plot that on a graph, I think it narrows down the number of behaviors they're most likely to focus on. I think then if you look at what ACER have put out in recent years, particularly with regard to cross-border wash trades, they've pretty much signaled their I guess, awareness of them and possible distaste towards them as well. I'm not saying that all of them are abusive, of course, but these are certainly indicators that if you are trading in the intraday markets, and this is something that needs to be considered from an abuse perspective. Now, of course, in the past, because it has required cooperation from multiple member states to I guess take these through to a full investigation and conclusion, you've probably found that most NRAs have been a little bit reticent to do that. I mean, it has happened, but probably less enthusiasm to do that, given that the resource and coordination that would take. Now that you have ACER having the ability to stand over that, I think this to me is an absolutely obvious area that they're going to focus on. So firms are active in the SIDC market, definitely be aware of this cross-border activity. Just make sure that you're not inadvertently overdoing it on interconnector capacity, given that they will now have full sight of that and will have the power to go after it.
So essentially continuous monitoring of that regulatory landscape, essentially, is what you're saying. Yes, and Lorne, finally, your summary.
Yeah, I was trying to think of something maybe a bit cheesy, but the best defense is a good offense. So, surveillance is really not a box ticking exercise, and it shouldn't be seen that way, because the fines are real, the reputational risk can far outweigh the penalty itself. But there's a real opportunity to add value to the firm by implementing a thorough compliance program that builds on the market abuse risk assessment that Aviv talked about. And, I'm not saying you have to rush out and buy a system, but I'm saying that you need to do something that's proportional to your trading activity and that's proportional to your market risk assessment. So there's plenty of things that you can do, and it's better to be doing something than nothing.
Sounds good. So, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for taking the time this morning to go through this session. It's been very interesting and informative. And I'm sure that you're all prepared to take questions as they arise from people watching this who will contact you probably. And it just remains for me to say thank you very much and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thanks for the invitation.
Bye, everyone.